Or director of the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies at the Faculty of Arts, and I have the pleasure basically of introducing our speaker for the Professor Ireda and Michael Tarnavetsky 2025 Distinguished Lecture Series. Before I start, I also wanted just to acknowledge our chair here from the Policy Council, Ms. Alexandra Kozelko is here also joining us, and I'm happy that she's actually participating in the event, also had time to join us. Serhy Yekelchyk, Professor Yekelchyk, is born and educated in Ukraine, received his doctorate PhD from University of Alberta. He is the author of 8 books on modern Ukrainian history and Russo-Ukrainian relations, including the award-winning Stalin Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of the Total War, published by Oxford University Press back in 2014. A professor of history and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria in British Columbia. He is currently also the president of the Canadian Association of Ukrainian Studies. His topic for this evening is 2 Russian invasions, a century apart, echoes of 1917 to 1921 in the current Russian-Ukrainian war. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions, hopefully at the end when he gives you a nice comparison of 1917 and the current situation that is happening in Ukraine. The session is recorded also, so for individuals that may have an interest to share that with their students, it will be on our website for the center that we have. So just let us know, or you can actually access the website if you need to. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Serhy Yekelchyk.
Thank you very much for your generous introduction. Thank you also for the invitation to this event. I'm going to talk about something which is sometimes seen as superficial, because the comparison between 2 important historical periods could be based on things that do not reflect the actual complex historical evolution. But they can also be revealing in that you see by examining one period what we have missed potentially about examining the other one. It is on this methodological ground that I'm going to approach the issue of the 2 Russian invasions of Ukraine. The parallel between the Bolshevik attack on the Ukrainian People's Republic in 1917 and the Russian Federation's aggression against Ukraine in 2014 and more decisively in 2022 has been made before. Scholars and political commentators in Ukraine mention the term 100 years war of Russia against the Ukrainian independence. This conceptualization is intuitive, and also it fits very well with the historical narrative now present in Ukraine, in which it is the attempts to gain independence that constitute the substance of Ukrainian history during the 20th and 21st century. However, if we look at the 2 Russias being compared in my talk here today, there is actually a tension in present-day Russian historical policy of memory between the Russia we see as the first incarnation of the empire which attacked today, and the Russia they see as the previous incarnation of the Russian Empire. The Ukrainian observers always invariably have in mind Lenin's Bolshevik government and its annexationist designs on Ukraine. However, Mr. Putin is not particularly fond of Lenin. In fact, he very clearly indicated his support of the opposite vision in the Russian Civil War, the one represented by the White Army, led in particular by General Anton Denikin. He would go and lay flowers on the grave of General Denikin. He would recommend the journalists to study Denikin's writings, because in these writings, Putin claimed, it was made clear that the question of Ukraine, of Little Russia, is in fact the Russian question, which needs to be solved by Russia itself without any foreign involvement. What I'm going to show in this talk today is that, in fact, also Putin would deny continuity with the Bolshevik policies of the early 20th century. In essence, these policies shared great many features not only with his policies, but also with the ones by the White Army. I will also try to determine the theoretical background for that, which will be formulated as the problem of imperial ambiguity of the Russian Empire, never quite being sure where Russia actually ends. And of course, Mr. Putin's most recent statement to that effect, which was picked up by the media, is that wherever the Russian soldier arrives, the Russian border is going to be. So, let's then go to 1917 and examine what happens in the Ukrainian territories of the Russian Empire in 1917. And there is a very notable revival of Ukrainian life. Suddenly, people appear on the streets for rallies, march with the blue and yellow flag, and there is an overall feeling of this fresh spring of the nations, of the empire being destroyed and deconstructed. It also helps that it is an early spring, and there is also flood on the river Dnipro. And so that revolutionary emotion out there in the open, and the nature itself supporting it with an early spring, seems to many to be an indication of how things are going to unfold from then onwards. What is, however, not entirely clear is if the Ukrainian movement is now claiming the Ukrainian lands, including Kiev, which is understood from the very beginning as the capital of the future Ukrainian state and the capital of past Ukrainian states. Who are the people on the ground who also claim this land to be theirs? It turns out that the Russian Empire never, in fact, developed a clear theoretical distinction between the ethnic Russian identity and imperial identity. As we all know, probably, the Russian Empire introduced oppressive measures against the Ukrainian culture and language, banning in particular publications in Ukrainian in the 1860s and 70s, banning also the instruction in Ukrainian in any school system, even though schools are created and voluntarily run by the students. But what the empire did not do was to organize a concerted assimilationist drive. It did not create a parallel system of schooling for the peasants, persuading them that they are Russians. It did not take any measures that you would imagine today as part of cultural genocide, when the identity is not just being erased, but also there is a concerted effort to show that there is something else coming in its place and force this upon the group. So the Russian Empire does not do that. You could argue that it had no logistical capacity for things like that, but it's very clear that the government is not really identifying with any modern nationalist agenda. Modern Russian nationalism is, of course, as argued by some of my colleagues, historians, is born precisely in Kiev, precisely as a reaction to the Ukrainian movement, precisely as the reaction to the Ukrainian challenge, which claimed the peasants, the land, the history for modern Ukraine. it is this event that actually forces modern Russian nationalists to get organized. They're very slow. They don't create any modern political party. They do have the support of the imperial authorities. There's a subsidy for the most pro-Russian of all pro-Russian newspapers in Kiev. The Tsar appoints most prominent Russian nationalists from Kiev to the state council, the upper chamber of the parliament. There is a movement which argues that the Little Russian land is an important part of the empire. Also, it does have some cultural specificity. This phenomenon, in fact, is quite interesting to modern historians. Some of you see in this the moment of defining how modern identities are being made. Now, in this particular case, we have a study of identities not being made. Because all of a sudden, in 1917, the Russians, the self-proclaimed Russians living in Ukraine and in Kiev, constituting, in fact, a plurality in the city of Kiev, need to somehow define themselves against the new Ukrainian parties. Instead of defining themselves politically, they define themselves as Russians, as the Russian bloc. The Russian bloc does not have any particular political agenda as stated, but everybody assumes that it stands for the restoration of Imperial Russia in some form. The Russian bloc actually does very well during the elections in Kiev in 1917. There are three types of elections: a municipal, Ukrainian Legislative Assembly, and the Russian Constituent Assembly. The bloc does fairly well, which is quite interesting for a force which has no political program as such. The only political program they have is to stop the forced Ukrainization of Southern Rus. And of course, when you hear about the forced Ukrainization of Southern Rus, that's precisely the kind of language Mr. Putin would use and his propaganda cadre would use in describing the reason for the invasion of Ukraine. They, in other words, proceed on the assumption that something is there already pre-existing. It is called Rus, and this Rus is identical with the Russia they imagine. Also, of course, that's not at all the case if you historically examine the origins of the term. So, interestingly enough, this ethnic definition is having a difficult time being established. During the conflicts in 1919, at some point the White Army of General Denikin actually takes the Ukrainian capital of Kiev. But at the same time, the army of the Ukrainian People's Republic enters from another side. The two armies meet, try to figure out the attitudes. Turns out also that the commander of the Galician unit, which represents the UNR army, only speaks Viennese German, which nobody quite understands. But then, of course, it turns out that he is invited to the Russian general, who is also German. And they have a discussion about what is Ukraine and whether Ukraine exists. What is notable in this discussion is that the Russian general does not see the Ukrainian one as a traitor, because he comes from Habsburg lands. And so all the so-called, quote-unquote, Galicians are seen in a very different light by the White Army, as foreign Slavs who would have, of course, benefited from being conquered by the Russian army, but if this is not an option right now, this can wait. Whereas the attitude to the Ukrainian army, which was raised in the former Russian Empire, is completely different. It is the treasonous Little Russians. And therefore, they cannot be seen as part of the Russian nation, because they made a political choice. Now, this trouble with the political choice becomes fairly obvious already by 1919, that moment when the whites managed to overtake the Ukrainian, the central Ukraine, actually. At this point, the Russian bloc from the elections in 1917 actually approaches the Russian military administration with one request. And that request is to start ignoring any cultural specificity of Little Russia. quite telling. So prior to that, it was perfectly all right to acknowledge the cultural specificity of Little Russia, because that in itself did not have political implications. Now, however, with the Ukrainian Revolution unfolding, with the Ukrainian People's Republic being created, with the Ukrainian People's Republic actually claiming the 9 provinces of the former Russian Empire based on things like language, folk customs, self-identification, the culture is no longer innocent. Culture it comes with political implications, and this is precisely the reason why the Russian bloc wants to erase the notion of Little Russia, which is quite interesting. They just want the White Army to see Ukraine as Russia, not in any way different. So that already is an important change, which, by the way, takes us to Putin, who as well is very reluctant to stress the notion of Little Russia, which is Russia but a different one. To him it is in fact straightforward Russianness that is present in Ukraine. So today, when you look at the statements emanating from the Russian administration, it turns out that they do not want, in fact, to incorporate Eastern Galicia. Even so, Putin speaks publicly about all of Ukraine being ours, which is in the context of discussing Sumska Oblast, which is in the left bank in eastern Ukraine. He doesn't seem to have an appetite to incorporate Galicia. In fact, he, at a press conference on December 22nd, 2022, cited the words of a conservative Tsarist politician, one-time Minister of the Interior, Pyotr Durnovo, addressed to Nicholas II, "If you want to lose Ukraine, then attach Galicia to it." So Mr. Putin's recipe for that is well known for those who follow the news. There was no plan for the Russian army to overtake all of Ukraine. It was from the very start intended to only conquer the eastern, southern, and central Ukraine, and then leave a military cordon sanitaire isolating western Ukraine. Ideally, the Russian propagandists would have wanted, of course, Poland and Hungary to take back as much as possible of western Ukrainian lands, but these countries did not, of course, do that so far, which means that Mr. Putin's imagination of what is Russia is then not a modern ethnic imagination, but rather it is similar to the one which had existed in the Russian Empire. So you have to be Eastern Slavic, Orthodox, loyal to the Tsar, and with origins in the Russian Empire and not Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is quite interesting too. Also, if you think about it, Mr. Putin's plan to divide Ukraine and distribute it and divide it among Russia, Poland, Hungary, and such would have restored the imperial borders of before 1914, which would go directly back to the age which Putin seems to like, the age of empires, the age before World War I, the age before modern nationalism and human rights and other such things. So there is an ambiguity there, not only in the notion of what is Russia, but also in the notion of what is Ukraine, which really is Russia. And that imperial ambiguity is traceable to the period 100 years prior. We do know that the whites paid a heavy price for refusing to recognize Ukraine. Denikin never quite came up with this in his emigre years, but his successor, Admiral Pyotr Wrangel, was pretty blunt about it. But the policy towards Ukraine, and generally the policy toward the nationalities, was wrong. Of course, for the white leader to acknowledge that, it took the White Army being bottlenecked in the Crimean Peninsula without access to food or fresh water, and really dependent on the support of Poland and other forces in any sortie from the Crimea. And it was at this point that Wrangel, in fact, opened negotiations with the Ukrainian People's Republic, which led nowhere because he only was able to make a statement in principle that there could be autonomy within the Russian state. But he was never able to, he never had the freedom to deconstruct the notion of the Russian state itself. It was in this position that the white ideology essentially ended with the end of the Russian Civil War. Now, if we accept the thesis that the Bolsheviks, to a degree, also shared the same Russian ambiguity about what is Russia and specifically what is Ukraine, quite a few things would start making sense. For instance, it was very notable that in 2014, with the start of Russian aggression against Crimea and in the Donbass, the Russian state did not acknowledge the presence of the Russian army in the region. Instead, it claimed that the conflict in Ukraine constituted a civil war between the pro-Western and pro-Russian Ukrainians. Of course, Lenin and Stalin also publicly, repeatedly assured that it was a civil war in Ukraine rather than the invasion of Russian Bolsheviks, which in fact destroyed the symbiosis of various socialist parties which did exist in multiple Ukrainian cities, even in Kharkiv. Now, of course, it turns out that the civil war Mr. Putin has in mind is a different civil war from the one the Bolsheviks were willing to acknowledge. The Bolsheviks needed the notion of the civil war in order not to appear imperialistic. They took very seriously the idea that you should ignore the freedom of self-determination, but you should be appearing as endorsing the freedom of self-determination. For that reason, it was difficult politically for Lenin to acknowledge that it is, in fact, the Russian troops that are fighting in Ukraine. Moreover, when it came to later struggles with Ukrainian leftist parties, in particular, very influential party of Borovists, the left Ukrainian socialist revolutionaries, who at some point joined the Bolsheviks, but never quite subscribed to the notion of Ukraine being incorporated into Russia, Lenin was reluctant to attack them on this ground. So instead of attacking them because they want independent Ukraine, he wanted to attack them as bad communists. So he manipulated the resolution of the Comintern to include the statement that they represent the petty bourgeois interests, that they are not good communists. It's not about Ukraine because we endorse theoretically the self-determination drive, but it is about them not being good communists to pursue building that potentially independent Ukraine. So now, Mr. Putin's civil war is of course different. The initial claim was in relation to Ukraine itself when denying that the Russian forces are involved in the fighting. The later claim, the way it transitioned to by 2022 and later, is more complex, and it can be seen very easily that Putin himself and other officials of his administration are using it reluctantly and with reservations. So in the most recent interpretation, the war between Russia and Ukraine itself can be seen by some Russian officials as a civil war, but they would always say to a degree, not fully. For instance, Putin never said unambiguously that it was a civil war within a single nation. In December 2023, he declared that what is happening now in Ukraine is a huge tragedy, similar to a civil war when brothers have ended up on the opposite sides. Then he continued, and now, despite the entire tragedy of the events taking place, at their core, Russians and Ukrainians are still a single people. But then a journalist asked the next question, and he shifted to something else completely. He said, the entire southeast of Ukraine has always been pro-Russian, because these are historically Russian lands. And then he went on to elaborate. But now he was speaking only about one particular region, whereas his previous claim was that the entire Ukrainian nation did not exist because they were part of Russia. So here again, we have a very recognizable imperial ambiguity first observed in the last years of the Russian Empire. They cannot quite decide what it is that they want, and on what ground they are going to claim it. And this situation, of course, is evolving. So whether it is the conquest, whether it's been historically part of the empire, or never been historically part of some kind of Ukraine, which Mr. Putin, of course, would not see anywhere. He actually pursued this qualified Civil War reference in an interview with Tucker Carlson in February 2025, using a phrase that sounds awkwardly in the original Russian as well. What is happening is, to some extent, an element of civil war. So he wouldn't call it a civil war. He would acknowledge an element of civil war. And why is that? And one obvious explanation would, of course, be that in Russian history and historical memory, a civil war is a conflict, not the conflict which is an ideological conflict within the same nation. So if it is a civil war, then you would need to figure out who is pushing for the past, who is pushing for the future. So whose ideology is progressive, whose is regressive. So he does not want this particular Russian model to be applicable to the Russo-Ukrainian war itself. And therefore, the ambivalent Russian explanations of the war's nature are neither fully ethnic-based nor simply colonial. They are more complex than that. And it is in this, in fact, ambiguity that the policies of present-day Russia are grounded. But were the Bolshevik attitudes towards Ukraine all that different? The famous Ukrainian anarchist warlord Nestor Makhno recalled that during his meetings with the Bolshevik leaders in the spring of 1918, he realized that all of them were avoiding the term Ukraine. They were actually referring to Ukraine as southern Russia or simply the south. Makhno objected to that, challenged it, and Lenin allegedly responded in an enigmatic way. "Comrade," said Lenin, "it is one thing to hold such views, and an altogether different thing to see what real life is like." What did Lenin mean by that? That he himself, Lenin, was still a kind of colonialist Russian, but he acknowledged that he needed to make concessions to Ukraine? Did he actually see it as perhaps the moment of changing policies? So I come back to this point later in the paper. It is well known that the Bolsheviks advancing into Ukraine in December 1917 and January 1918 quite brutally destroyed Ukrainian communal life. It all started in the city of Kharkiv, the unlikely location where the Bolsheviks were still working together with Ukrainian Social Democrats. It was the detachment arriving from Russia that forced the local Bolsheviks to start arresting the Ukrainian Social Democrats and disarming the local units sympathizing with Ukraine. In fact, some prominent Bolsheviks rushed on scene and said, "Comrades, what are you doing?" So we are going to organize, because they had a project of organizing a Soviet Ukrainian Republic as the answer to the Ukrainian People's Republic. So one of these people was, in fact, Artyom, the well-known Bolshevik leader, who rushed to the scene saying, "Well, but we are working with Ukrainian Social Democrats. We need to create our Ukrainian Republic." And yet those newcomers from the north were extremely brutal and insisted on their policies. Some of them actually settled in Ukraine after the conquest. There was one particular sailor who lived a long life as a retiree in Ukraine, claiming that he was the one who took Kiev. So these sailors from the Baltic Navy and workers from Moscow remained, in fact, the most reliable units of the Russian Bolshevik army in Ukraine throughout the war. If you read the 4-volume memoir of the commander of the Ukrainian front of the Bolshevik army, Vladimir Antonov Ovseyenko, so as you see, his second name sounds Ukrainian, and in fact Lenin himself issued to him a special instruction to stop using his party nom de guerre Antonov and return to using his actually Ukrainian surname Ovseyenko. Baltic sailors, the Chinese, and other international units, who at this point are very often Hungarian, raised from the Hungarian POWs from World War I, the Austrian, the former Habsburg subjects. It is the point which comes through very clearly. So there is the ethnic thinking there. It is pleasant, it is present. Even so, the language of the Bolsheviks is technically the language of the social revolution, but they do have an understanding that the socialist revolution has an ethnic dimension. Nobody is more aware of that than Stalin. In early January 1920, Stalin publishes in Pravda an important article about the situation on the Southern Front. He actually then adds an addendum to this article because he submitted it before the final defeat of the Whites, which really turned the tide of the war in the South, in the Russian South. But what he speaks about is that the revolution is in fact the Russian Revolution. That it is in fact due to the fact that the proletariat in the Russian provinces, in the Russian cities, supported the revolution, that it was able to win. He says that during the revolution, the opposition was limited to the outskirts of the Russian Empire. Therefore, the minorities were counter-revolutionary, and therefore the Russian working class was bound to win. He actually names the minorities. All of them are from the Caucasus and Central Asia, except for one, Ukrainians. So, of course, what this article reproduces is a very familiar colonial lens. Because the people in Ukraine who supported the Bolshevik Revolution were very often ethnic Russians or Russified working class in the wishful thinking of the Bolsheviks, because in reality they were more often lower middle class, could be Polish, Jewish, Russian, it really doesn't matter. But what matters is that they represented the cities as imperial administrative outposts and trading outposts, and they held a certain set of beliefs toward the peasantry, the peasant language, and the peasant culture. These views were condescending. They are well documented. A very prominent Ukrainian Bolshevik by the name of Vladimir Zatonsky was around when the Bolsheviks took Kiev in early 1919. The soldiers apparently stopped on the street whoever they could find and checked the paperwork. If a person produced the paperwork in Ukrainian, the ID in Ukrainian, they killed them, or at least arrested. Zatonsky made a stupid mistake of actually producing his ID in Ukrainian because he was the minister of the Bolshevik Ukrainian government. But then he realized he's going to be killed now, and he reached into another pocket and produced another ID in Russian with Lenin's personal signature. So in his particular case, the problem was solved, but the problem was greater than his case. It was, in fact, an indication that no imperial ambiguity makes it less likely for the empire to commit genocide. That being ambiguous about the exact relation between Ukraine and Russia still requires isolating those Ukrainians who are sure they are not Russians. And so that's exactly what the Bolsheviks are doing in 1918 and 1919. Whoever has an ID in Ukrainian, whoever speaks Ukrainian in the city, not in the village. In the village it was okay. Whoever speaks Ukrainian in the city immediately is being suspected as a political Ukrainian. And that's precisely the category they wanted to get rid of. And here, of course, we have a direct parallel with the genocidal actions of Mr. Putin's Russia in Bucha and elsewhere, where they tried to identify people who were active in Ukrainian community and political life, volunteering for the army and such, and kill them. So that ambiguity, in other words, does not prevent genocide. It, in fact, makes it possible. Secondly, Zatonsky stayed in the Ukrainian government, but already in 1918, he discovered something troubling. He argued that Bolshevism was becoming Russian colonial ideology, in a sense that it is no longer the Russian ruling classes and capitalists who are exploiting Ukraine, but rather that Ukraine was being exploited for the benefit of the Russian workers and peasants. That, he argued, was a new type of colonialism, and yet it was also based on very similar imperial prejudices. And behind much of that, from the point of view of economic and social history, was the extraction of resources. As you know, Mr. Putin's Russia was also quite serious about first disrupting Ukrainian grain trade, then collecting vegetables in southern Ukraine, and in other ways, not only destroying the Ukrainian economy, but also trying to get the resources from Ukraine. That, of course, was even more important for the Bolsheviks. They were fairly specific about that. They organized special detachments for that particular purpose, to collect the foodstuffs from the peasants at minimum or symbolic or no pay whatsoever, which of course immediately caused peasant rebellions. It is interesting that Lenin himself supervised this process in smallest detail. He was writing notes to the effect that, well, in that part of the Poltava province, I know there is a lot of sugar. So therefore, the local commanders were supposed to confiscate sugar. And then Lenin also insisted on all the trains with food, grain, sugar, and such being sent into Russia to be accompanied by armed guards, because he realized right away that the various army units would want to consume it straight away. The Bolsheviks designed an very interesting original system of actually paying the Red Army soldiers, allowing them regular parcels home. So the Russian soldiers operating in Ukraine were sending parcels, and that too was supervised by Lenin in the smallest possible detail. He writes drafts of resolutions about how we need to lower the payment for postal expenses of our worker guards who are currently in Ukraine and sending food back to their families to Russia. So he was extremely obsessive about this thing. There must be a reason for that, of course, right? And that reason would be that he saw Ukraine very much in the same way as Russian colonialists before and after him, as first of all, the land of resources which were needed for the proper functioning of the Russian Empire, without which the Russian Empire would never be powerful as it needed to be. Except, of course, the empire he was building was technically, formally, internationalists. However, it still observed a variety of traditions. It was guided by the perceptions created centuries before that, and sometimes elaborated on. For instance, if you read Lenin, and I received my undergraduate education in the Soviet Union, I read a lot of Lenin, in fact, the entire 55 volumes, I think. You would discover right away that Lenin is very fond of using the term samostinность. And he uses the term samostinность in the negative sense. Now, the term samostinность is actually a funny linguistic phenomenon. Russians believe that this is the Ukrainian term for independence, and it is also funny. In a way, you know, an imperial, highly educated gentleman would see as funny some kind of local peasant celebrations. But of course, the Ukrainian term for independence is in fact not samostinность. Samostinность is used more often for personal self-sufficiency, being able to do things. And yet, it entered the Russian language in this particular meaning. So Lenin is so fond of this term that you can see it is dear to him. He actually uses it not always in application to Ukrainian nationalists. In most cases, it is about the unruly Bolshevik subordinates very often operating in Ukraine. They do something wrong, and he says, well, I disapprove of this samostinность. But of course, it tells you something about sharing the pre-existing attitude, and of course you will not be surprised to find out that the white leaders, such as General Denikin, also used the term samostinность, which appeared to them to be a kind of funny, satirical reference to Ukrainian independence. Lenin was in this thing as well, as Makhno discovered that he was using the south of Russia. So I have to say that the notion of Ukraine as an ethnographic territory populated by the peasants speaking very closely related dialects constituting modern Ukrainian, sharing the customs, the tradition of embroidery and such, was also being established during that very same period. And before we believe Mr. Putin that it was Lenin who created Ukraine, it is worth having a brief look at what in fact is happening during the negotiations in 1918 between the Central Powers and the Bolshevik state. As you probably know, first maps of ethnographic Ukraine appeared in the 1860s and 70s. Mikhailo Dragomanov was the Ukrainian thinker influential in producing the first map of ethnographic Ukraine, which in the age of national self-determination was in fact the map of Ukrainian nation state in the waiting. It became widely known during World War I due to the publications of the Union for the Liberation of Ukraine, which was a socialist group of socialist emigres from the Russian Empire operating in Germany and Austria-Hungary, printing things in large print run, and then trying to hand them to the soldiers. And the soldiers going back from the imprisonment, going back to the former Russian Empire, carrying a little booklet with the map of Ukraine. And it happened that the moment was precisely right, because the soldiers wanted A, to stop fighting, and B, they wanted land. For both of these fundamental desires of the Ukrainian peasantry in 1917, the notion of Ukraine as separate from Russia was helpful. The soldiers were quite concerned about dying in the trenches, but they were also somewhat concerned about the Russian peasants arriving in Ukraine to participate in the land partitioning. This is a longer story behind the term land partitioning, in which I wouldn't go into this term. But in any case, the peasants wanted to get back first before the Russians come. Interestingly enough, you would think a peasant prejudice, but yeah, the Russians actually did come and they wanted the land, right? Except they were the Bolsheviks. So it was the moment in 1917 when the idea of Ukraine became, it spread like fire. It became a mobilizing device, which the Ukrainian politicians of the day did not quite understand in proper context, and they somewhat mismanaged it. Also, it is easy for us to say from a distance of 100 years that they did not quite mobilize this potential when it was difficult to do so. But we need to arrive in early 1919, when two separate peace treaties were concluded by the Ukrainian People's Republic first, and then by Soviet Russia, with the Central Powers, thus ending World War I on the Eastern Front. In these treaties, there was a provision built on that the Soviet Russian government would need to recognize the Ukrainian People's Republic and delineate the borders according to the principles spelled out in the third and fourth proclamations, universals, of the Ukrainian People's Republic. So what was the territory acknowledged as Ukrainian by the third and fourth universal? It was actually the 9 provinces of Tsarist Russia in which the Ukrainians constituted the majority. They didn't quite go to the level of the counties. There was a provision that eventually we will figure out. So decide on the provinces, but eventually if we need to exchange the counties, we will. In the end, of course, the exchange was always in favor of Russia in subsequent years. But these 9 provinces did not include the Crimean Peninsula. It was thus a decision of Ukrainian politicians not to claim the Crimean Peninsula, which they could have, because the Ukrainians constituted the majority in the province of Tavrida. North of the Crimea, you would get the prairies, lots of Ukrainian peasants. They could have claimed Crimea. But they did not, because they saw themselves as being involved in the same anti-colonial struggle about which we hear so much today. They acknowledged that Crimea was a historical homeland of the Crimean Tatars, and it was for that reason they basically expected the Crimean Tatar state to be created in the Crimea, that they didn't claim it. And this idea underwent a very interesting evolution soon. But in any case, when the Bolsheviks realized that the Germans and the Austrians actually have a notion of ethnographic Ukraine, which was spelled out in the third and fourth universal. They realized that they would have to somehow react to it. They react in a funny way. In a very typical Bolshevik fashion, they try to falsify things. They create a little tiny republic, the Donetsk Kryvyi Rih People's Republic, in order to claim that the peace treaty does not cover it, and therefore Germany cannot possibly occupy the Donbass. But Lenin says it's not going to work, comrades. Let's just, abandon this stupid separatism. You just need to acknowledge that the Germans are going to take all of Ukraine according to Vinnichenko's geography. But the Bolsheviks too make an exception for the Crimea. They actually send a note, which is drafted by Lenin in minute detail. He just obsessed with, spelling out every smallest detail. A note to Germany saying that, well, as far as we understand, the government of the Ukrainian People's Republic did not claim the Crimean Peninsula, which is why, by default, it must be the territory of the Russian Republic, because Ukrainians didn't claim it, and therefore you should not take over the Crimea. But of course, the Germans also think strategically. They do not want the Ukrainian state to be too powerful, and therefore they ban the forces of the Ukrainian Republic from advancing in the Crimea, create essentially a government which is conservative, white government, which is led by a general of a distant Tatar ancestry, but not Crimean Tatar, a different Tatar ancestry. So the Germans too seem to be interested in protecting Crimea for its strategic value from becoming Ukrainian. And so we actually just arrived to a point which I hope I will be able sometimes, after the Ukrainian victory, to make on Russian television. Lenin did not invent Ukraine. Lenin and the Germans invented the Russian Crimea. Because it was them who actually took advantage of the decolonial generosity of Ukrainian activists to claim that the Crimea was not Ukrainian at all. And for that reason, in fact, Lenin had a resolution of the Politburo already prepared proclaiming Crimea a separate republic. But then they changed their mind and decided it's better to actually claim it for Russia. And that, of course, is the reason why at the end of the Russian Civil War in 2021, Crimea is undergoing the Red Terror, people being executed all around, and the Bolsheviks decided it's not going to be part of Ukraine because, you see, Ukraine is unreliable. Ukraine can be conquered by somebody. Ukraine can become independent and claim the Crimea, which is the reason why Crimea then is included into the Russian Federation and not the reasons that they would prefer to talk about. So, in fact, Mr. Putin is wrong. Lenin did not create Ukraine. The notion of ethnographic Ukraine, which was pre-existed, was imposed on Lenin, but he took it. How he took it exactly? A shrewd politician that he was, regardless of this obsession with minute detail and every piece of paper being used and whatever small things, he thought that it would be a good idea to mobilize the patriotic sentiment if the German advance into Ukraine is presented as Germany's war on Ukraine, in which scenario Ukraine is the Bolshevik Ukraine, and therefore we need to protect it from evil Germans. But what of course happened in the process was the acknowledgement that Ukraine exists, and Ukraine has certain ethnographic borders. This is what Lenin does. He does it unwillingly. He is very sarcastic about Vinnichenko's geography. At some point, the Bolsheviks don't quite know where the borders of Ukraine end. In fact, at one point, they receive a radio text from the German government that the Kursk province, which is now in Russia, would need to be also vacated by the Red Army. But in fact, it does not happen. Only one county is counted as part of Ukrainian state. But what is interesting is that today, in the current war, when the Ukrainian army occupied significant parts of the Kursk Oblast, they actually never claimed it as Ukrainian ethnic territory Also, they could have. But that's the second could have moment, like the Ukrainian Democrats and the Crimea in 1917, and this is the second moment, the Ukrainian government and the Kursk Oblast today. They didn't, because the point was to emphasize the inviolability of existing borders, that you cannot start rewriting the borders, because that's precisely what Mr. Putin is doing. And of course, Artyom is sending a telegram to the Kaiser saying that he is the head of Donetsk and Kryvyi Rih Republic, and therefore the German and Ukrainian troops should not be coming in the territory of the Republic, to which Lenin says, not going to work. In other words, it is a forced acknowledgement. That's exactly what it is. So I will be sort of wrapping up my narrative. I have a ton here. I have a paper which is 16,000 words long, and that needs to be shortened for the publication in the journal. So what we then get here is actually the parallels that nobody wants to acknowledge. Not only the whites, but the Bolsheviks as well shared the same attitudes. Not only that, but they relied heavily on the same social stratum, lower middle class in the cities, and the workers. But of course, the workers were the elusive category which the Bolsheviks loved so much that they couldn't abandon it, even though the Bolsheviks actually disappeared with the industrial collapse during the Russian Civil War. So there were no workers. Therefore, when taking party censuses in Ukraine in particular, the Bolsheviks conducted a double accounting system. They had the current social status of the person, which was invariably official, whatever, in the army, or in state official, or Cheka official, and the previous social status, which was in many cases worker. This is how they argued that it was a workers' government. But of course, in the Ukrainian case, the workers' government was the government run by the people living in the cities, disparaging the culture of the countryside, relying on the countryside as a source of produce, and really interested in continuing this essentially colonial system of exploiting the countryside. That's what it was. And of course, in the case of Ukrainian Bolsheviks, it was demonstrated brilliantly throughout the 1920s, going through various incarnations of official Bolshevik policy and the actual kind of subterranean trend of what is happening there on the ground. So for instance, we get in 1923, Dmytro Lebed, who is the second secretary of the Communist Party in Ukraine, says that nobody can deny that Russian culture of the city, the Russian culture of the city is progressive, and the Ukrainian culture of the countryside is not. It is backward. Therefore, we, as we are building the future society, should organize, should support the class struggle of the progressive Russian culture against the Ukrainian one. He, of course, gets denounced for that because you're not supposed to be telling these things openly. But then in 1926, supposedly at the height of the Ukrainization policy, which is aimed to present the Soviet power as kind of more connected to the Ukrainian peasantry, we get Stalin's letter to Kaganovich, the leader of the Ukrainian Communist Party, in which Stalin handles the question of assimilating or not assimilating the Russian working class in Ukraine. And he said that it would be a mistake in terms of nationalities policy to force the Russian and Russian-speaking workers in Ukrainian cities to study Ukrainian. That, in fact, would be a form of national oppression. So, it is then very clear that the Bolsheviks are well aware of the nature of their social support in Ukraine and the policies they are pursuing there. It takes many years for them to even acknowledge that it is important to have a Ukrainian person as a head of the Communist Party in Ukraine. That only happens actually after Stalin's death as such, the acknowledgement of that being important. And my last point here is, of course, that, well, you see, if if Lenin was the source of all evil and he destroyed wonderful historical Russia to create some kind of fake pro-Western Ukraine, actually come to think of it, Marxism is a Western ideology as well, right? So, and of course in 2017, when Mr. Putin reluctantly opened a monument to the victims of the Great Terror in Russia, he never once mentioned Stalin in his speech, but he referred to Western revolutionary theories. Right? So the Bolsheviks were now responsible for the terror, but Stalin was a great empire builder. So if you then go back to the issue of Russian historical memory and imperial ambiguity with which we have started, then how to reconcile Mr. Putin's belief that the Bolsheviks destroyed great historical Russia with his upset about the dissolution of the Soviet Union, which he famously claimed to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. So if he loves the Soviet Union so much, how come he hates the foundation of the Soviet Union, the creation of the Soviet Union? And of course the answer to that would have to be in the same notion of imperial ambiguity, because the Soviet Union with which Mr. Putin and his generation would be familiar was the Soviet Union in which the relations between the Russian and Ukrainian nations were defined in a very ambiguous way. The Soviet Union never quite denied the existence of the Ukrainian nation, but it insisted that the reunification, quote unquote, of Russians and Ukrainians took place in the 17th century. Of course, only the two branches of the same nation can get reunited, which is, by the way, the objection some Ukrainian historians raised at the time, in 1954. So the kind of history Putin studied at school was the history which was really ambiguous about the existence of Ukrainians and the difference between Ukrainians and Russians. The history of Kievan Rus, the mighty medieval empire and a cultural power as well, was primarily claimed by Russia. Ukrainian archaeologists and historians were not actually even allowed to work on the Kievan Rus period. It was seen as primarily the Russian past. So in this kind of ambiguity, the late Soviet Union was actually reproducing the same uncertainty which the late Russian Empire had and which Mr. Putin's Russia has today. But also, the Soviet Union provided another term for Putin's vocabulary, the term nationalists. So if you follow the Russian media's coverage of the war, with the start of an all-out invasion, for the first maybe 5 to 6 months, it was always the Nazis and nationalists who resisted, because everybody else is, of course, really Russian. But then, eventually, it became impossible to deny that even ethnic Russians living in Ukraine do not necessarily sympathize with Mr. Putin's regime either. In fact, a great many of them, also Russian speakers, endorse the notion of democratic Ukraine. So at that point, the Russian media switched to saying foreign mercenaries and the armed forces of Ukraine are the people who are resisting. The nationalists disappeared. But of course, that Soviet notion of those Ukrainians who are political Ukrainians are actually nationalists, and therefore not real, not reflecting the true interests of the people, is reproduced also in the Russian conceptualization of what Ukraine is now, and it also feeds into the genocidal policies as well. So, arriving in Ukraine, it is important to identify and kill or otherwise disable the nationalists, the active political Ukrainians. And of course, for everybody else, as we now know, there is the reshaping of the educational system, there is a police control, there's a forced imposition of Russian citizenship, and other things. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for 4 or 5 questions. If anybody in the audience would like to ask any questions of Professor Yekelchyk. Anybody? Go ahead, please. If you can speak loud so we don't have a microphone there.
Sure. I just wanted to ask, with your last point, How does the all-Russian mentality that you're describing reconcile with the fact that Ukraine is a multinational nation?
Yeah, you have also to disclose our previous relationship, right? She was my honors student at the University of Victoria. Oh, actually, you're supposed to know everything because you were my honors student. Yeah, I'm actually reviewing one book which deals with the issue of Russian society and responses. And the notion of modern nationalism being linked to democracy might seem contradictory. But actually there is something to it, because at the origins of modern democracies in the 19th century, when nationalisms were reclaiming citizens, remaking imperial subjects into citizens. So it is not inconceivable, at least theoretically, that there could be an argument for the Soviet past and Ukraine and everything else being the Soviet legacy which prevents Russia from fully developing. In fact, this argument has been tried by President Yeltsin in the early 1990s. He was also in real difficulty about how to shape the Russian politics of memory, because he couldn't see the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union as satisfactory models. Therefore, he looked back to the Russian Provisional Government of 1917, which he somehow imagined to be democratic and offering freedom to all the nations and such, which of course, in the Ukrainian case, I have pages and pages in this paper about how the provisional government fought back against giving autonomy to Ukraine and claimed that, oh, you cannot possibly deprive us of the access to the Black Sea. That was a powerful democratic argument. You cannot deprive us of the access to the Black Sea. So it didn't work in Yeltsin's case. Also, I think, like 4 days after the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence, Yeltsin's press secretary said that Russia might advance territorial claims upon some former Soviet republics unless they conclude comprehensive friendship treaties with Russia, which was later blamed on the press secretary, but most likely described internal discussions within the Yeltsin cabinet, and in any case became the Russian policy later in the decade. So it is, but what Yeltsin did at the moment of the Soviet dissolution is, of course, something that prevented a violent war beginning right away, which so many commentators expected, in the West, in fact. Now that was the argument why the Soviet Union should be kept alive as long as possible. So President George Herbert Walker Bush, H.W. Bush, of course, gave his infamous Chicken Kiev speech in which he said that ethnic nationalism is a really bad thing, so the Soviet Union is wonderful, let's keep it, right? But it turned out that the position pursued by Yeltsin was in fact that the Soviet Union was taking away everything from Russia, and with its immense resources, which we cannot deny, the resources are immense, Russia would have been in a much better economic position than being a heart of the empire. So he made this argument. This argument worked short term, but didn't work the long term. Now, I can go on about that for quite a while, about how the West mismanaged that transition as well, by basically deciding, oh, everything is solved. It's okay. Now there is a wonderful democratic Russia. We don't need to support the creation of a civil society or anything. The underinvestment in civil society, the underinvestment in the evaluation of the Soviet period, which in Ukraine produced what? The Holodomor as the principal symbol of the Soviet policy in Ukraine, the genocidal famine. Whereas, of course, in Russia, we still have like at least half, sometimes a majority of people polled on this issue, arguing that Stalin was a great historical leader and such. So, not without some hope, but again, it would need more effort from Ukraine and much, much more effort from the West.
Anyone else have any questions? Professor Shkuderi?
I liked your comparisons, your analogy with Denikin, General Denikin, and the pre-revolutionary Russia. I think it's useful also in considering Russian policy towards nationalities to think of the late imperial period. You said nothing about Finland, Baltics, the South, Moldova, the conquest of the Caucasus, various expansionist movements. From my readings, Russia had a very ambiguous attitude to all these, but a very clever, well thought out and consistent policy. When it was forced into concessions, it made concessions. Whenever it could assimilate, whenever it could ban the language, whenever it could end the religious independence, it did so. So it was a far more clever and a far more nuanced policy. And I think that that policy, that experience must have influenced not only the whites, but also the Bolsheviks. They inherited a long tradition of manipulating and Russifying provinces and playing games in which they would allow a certain amount of independence, but then take it away immediately. So there's a I think if you kind of step back a little bit further and look at the wider picture, you see continuity, a strong continuity between pre-revolutionary Russia and what came afterwards.
Yeah, thank you for that point. Absolutely, I could have gone. Lenin, for instance, argues in his letter to the workers and peasants of Ukraine that, look, Estonia proclaimed independence and we granted the independence of Estonia. And we, he says, are undecided as yet about granting or not granting the independence of Ukraine. I also cut out a really important piece which will probably resonate with that about long-term policies, and that is also Denikin and the whites have an issue with Galicians, but Lenin does so as well. But he is much more straightforward because he takes the notion of ethnographic Ukraine and runs away with it. He realizes it can be a political tool. So there is the secret speech. Well, Khrushchev had his secret speech. Lenin also had his secret speech, which he gave analyzing the reasons of Soviet defeats in the war with Poland. Fascinating reading. But one thing he says that Galicia is all important because it gives us access right into the heart of Europe right away. And Lenin even speaks of Transcarpathia, which he calls, like any Russian of the time, would Carpathian Rus. He says Carpathian Rus already sees much discontent, but this is nothing compared to Hungary. However, in order to get to Hungary to support the Bolshevik revolution there, we need to go through the Carpathian Rus. And this is the moment when you suddenly have the proof that Lenin actually accepts the notion of ethnographic Ukraine and sees it as his weapon in his policies. So he's on the one hand continuing the perceptions from the imperial period. On the second, he is working on the groundwork for the Stalin project of 1939, invading Poland, because it is all already present in Lenin's writings, which is quite inconvenient for those people who want to really to oppose Lenin's take on that to Stalin's. So he pragmatically accepts the notion, well, if everybody operates the notion of ethnographic Ukraine, we'll take it and make it ours. It's not going to be a sovereign nation. It's going to be only rubber stamping of Moscow policies. But he says it can be useful. And then they spend decades working on this, funding various organizations in Galicia under the Polish authority, and at some point even the Ukrainian military organization, which is going to become the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, is also applying for Soviet support based on precisely that policy of irredenta, unredeemed, kind of the lands of Ukraine that were left behind, not united with it. So kind of really strange bedfellows you would encounter going into the 20s. And yeah, this is a continuation on the one hand. On the other, I think it's fairly clear that Lenin discovers Ukraine very late, as you probably know, right? So he doesn't write much on the nationalities issue at all. He's a straightforward imperialist until 1914, when he lives in Galicia in Krakow, on the Polish side. And apparently, according to Soviet scholars, he attended a party on Shevchenko's birthday, somewhere in Krakow. Everybody wearing vyshyvanka, whatever, singing songs. I wonder how Soviet, artists did not present a historical painting of Lenin wearing a vyshyvanka, like in order to advance to Hungary to conquer more European space, things like that. So yeah, there's also the context of that, the Hungary and Romania, because the whole story of mid-1919 in Ukraine, which is an enormously complex subject on which I will be spending hundreds of pages in various books, is that they want to invade Hungary as soon as possible, which is trying to figure out how best to do it, but Ukraine then becomes crucial for that. And I'm just sort of hoping that maybe somebody would tell Viktor Orban that his pro-Russian policies are therefore misguided, also for all kinds of other reasons too.
Thank you very much. Let me call on our postdoc fellow at the Center for Ukrainian Canadian Studies, Dr. Oksana Klemenko, to share a few words with you.
As Professor Top said, I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ukrainian and Canadian Studies, and I would like to say thank you so much, Professor Yekelchyk, for this wonderful presentation. Also my colleagues who organized this event, and of course, thank you so much everyone who came to this lecture today. I think it's so crucial for everyone, so thank you. And in November also we will organize another lecture. It will be online about Holodomor, so I hope you will join again. Thank you.